Hello and welcome. My name is Hannah Kaufman from the FECC Writing Lab, and I'm here to talk to you about the research process. For this discussion, let's talk about writing at all times. People always ask me, what's my number one advice for working on a research-based essay? And my best advice that I can give you is that you should always be writing something, which really confuses people because the primary advice most folks get is to start researching, right? Figure out what you're doing and start Googling your topic. That only goes so far because first you need to know what you even want to know about your topic. You want to know what you think you know already about your topic and what your audience needs or wants to know. So I find that it's most helpful, first of all, to sit down and just write out what you know or what you think you know about the topic. For these discussions, it's easiest to have examples. So I have selected my own topic, which is antibody titer tests. Who even knows what those are? So as an example of writing down what you know or what you think you know, a few years ago, I was teaching a course on essays, and I had a student who wanted to write about canine bordetella, which you may know as kennel cough. She wanted to look into how animals get kennel cough, how to keep it from spreading, these kinds of things. When she was writing about that, she wrote that titers can be done to determine whether an animal requires a canine bordetella vaccination. Basically, from that, I learned that a titer is a blood test that can be done to determine whether an animal has antibodies to a particular disease or virus. Okay, so I also learned during that adventure with my student, which was fantastic, by the way. The paper turned out great. I learned that humans can also have titer testing done to determine whether they are immune to a particular virus or disease. If you have received or someone has received a vaccine, a blood test can be done to determine whether that vaccine, A, produced immunity in that individual, and B, to determine how strong that immune response is in that individual. That got me thinking in this day and age where lots of folks are maybe skeptical about vaccination, and lots of folks maybe think that kids are receiving too many vaccinations, those kinds of things. I got to wondering whether titers can be run for children in order to determine whether their vaccines have produced sufficient immunity that they don't need to receive more vaccines for a particular disease. So I started looking around on the internet, and I found, just randomly in one of my Google searches, a brochure from, I think, the state of Texas, that says that the MMR vaccine, actually the measles, mumps, and rubella, only needs a single dose, but it does not produce immunity in about 5% of people who receive it. So a second dose is recommended just to make sure that somebody is immune. That made me wonder, how many vaccines are like that, and is it really necessary to receive several doses of a vaccine, or could a titer be run to determine whether somebody is sufficiently immune to that disease? So for these videos, whatever you watch in that series, that's going to be our topic. That's what we're talking about, okay? And you'll see these sources that I'm talking about. But when I say that you should be writing at all times when you're writing from research, I actually recommend getting paper, a journal. You can do this in a Google Doc if you want to, but write down, first of all, why you're interested in the topic and what you know or what you think about what you think you know about the topic. That story I just told you, that's what I would write down, along with those questions that I asked. is this useful in children? How many doses, how many vaccines only require a single dose to produce immunity? Usually, right? And some people they don't. So what's the failure rate to produce immunity? These kinds of questions, these come to me as I'm thinking about the topic. And those are the things I'm going to start researching when I go out online. But first, I want to write down my own curiosity about the topic because that can help me narrow my topic down. When we're talking about vaccines, vaccines are a super touchy topic, right? People have all kinds of perspectives. Some of you may have already rolled your eyes like, oh no, here we go. Like we're saying that some kids are being over vaccinated or whatever. I'm curious, but I believe in vaccines and I have vaccinated my kiddos and I pay attention to the schedule, right? But I am curious whether maybe there's a more useful way to go about the vaccination process. And so I'm going to let that curiosity guide me in this research project, okay? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write down how I got interested in the topic. And then because I found out that MMR and MMRV are a vaccine that sometimes only needs to happen once, it's just that they give those additional doses out of caution. I think that's something I've read. So now I need to check if it's true. Okay, I'm going to narrow down and just talk about MMR or MMRV. V stands for varicella, which is chickenpox, and find out what the different doses do, whether they increase the immune response if we get more than one. I'm going to find out whether it's true that we really only need the one, and I want to know if titers are useful in helping make that determination. Okay, so that's what I'm going to write down. The next thing I'm going to do, this is before I ever start doing much research, right? I told you I wandered around on the web a little bit and found this and found that and found the other thing, but I'm not doing like in-depth research yet. Right now, I'm just finding out what I even want to know about the topic to guide me. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually write research questions. Now, usually I do this in my notebook. And in fact, I've already written them down in this notebook. But when you are getting ready to go out and research online, it really helps to come up with some research questions that you're going to put into the search engine. Google and most other search engines are run based on artificial intelligence algorithms. They're programmed to go out and find as many pieces of information as possible based on what you input into the system. So if you put in a word like vaccines into the search engine, you're going to get a lot of responses, and it's going to take a long time to weed through those responses. However, if you spend the time to write out very specific things you want to know, and you put the full form of those questions into the search engine, you get more specific results much more quickly. Okay, so I have questions like, what are titer tests? Right? I've heard this term, but I don't really know what they are. I don't really know how they work. I want to find out. So I'm going to write it out in full form. I also want to make sure that I'm writing open-ended questions that cannot be answered with a yes or no. And I want to make sure that my questions are as free of bias as possible. A lot of times when we are looking into something, our assumptions or our bias, our own perspective, our thoughts about whether something is good or bad or right or wrong, come through in our search queries, which directs the answers we get back, the sources we get from the search engine toward our own perspective. We really want to try to avoid that. We want to get the most objective information possible. Okay, so I'm not going to say something like, why are titer tests useful? Because that includes a bias that I already think titer tests are useful, and it's only going to bring me stuff that says they are. Instead, and I don't want to say, are titer tests useful? Because that's a yes or no question, right? So I want to know maybe when titer tests are useful or what titer tests are used for, okay? So I want to know, what do titers test for? What are they looking for? What do they measure? Okay. I want to know how reliable are titer tests. Okay. Do they have other names? The reason I want to know this is because here in the United States, we use the word titer tests. Okay. But in other countries, for instance, they say spell things differently than I do. So I've already been wandering around on the internet a little bit, and I have seen that in other countries that use British English, they spell it this way, titer, instead of this way. And sometimes they're actually referring to something else when they use this spelling. Isn't that exciting? So I need to be aware of that as a researcher, and I need to take careful notes as I go out on the internet looking for information. Okay, so how long after vaccination should titers be taken? Because I know from my own vaccinations and having my own children vaccinated that sometimes there isn't an immune response for 7 days, 10 days, 12 days. And the vaccination schedule is laid out so that there are several weeks between doses, and that's to give the vaccination time to work. So you can't get a vaccine and then get a titer taken right away because your body hasn't developed antibodies to that particular disease or virus or whatever it is yet. You have to wait. Okay. So I usually recommend to my students that they write anywhere from like 5 to 10 open-ended, carefully thought out questions. Okay. So I want to know, like, how does age affect titer accuracy? Okay, so I want to know, for instance, if it's different in a young child than it is in an adult. So what I'm going to do now that I have these questions is I'm going to take one of them and I'm going to put it in its fullest form into my search engine. So I'm going to say, how does age affect titer accuracy? Now notice that this is coming up with dogs and cats. So a lot of the information is geared toward veterinary stuff. So I need to be aware of that because I'm not looking for it in animals. I'm looking for it in humans. Now, anymore, Google has this handy dandy thing that shows up, which is an AI overview. Please be careful of this. Okay, I will have other discussions about AI, but please note that AI goes out and finds the most commonly presented information. That does not necessarily make it accurate information, especially because it's looking on the general internet, not on like useful things like Google Scholar or more well verified scientific content. Okay, so you can look and see what kinds of sources it offers over here, but you really want to be careful not to get information from this discussion right here from the AI overview. Do not trust this. You can look up more information about what this says, but do not take information from here. Okay, so I've got this National Institutes of Health, How Aging Impacts Vaccine Efficacy. Interesting. I'm going to right click on this and open the link in new tab. Here we're talking about B cells, age effects, quantity but not quality of antibody responses. This is 2012. I don't know if this is about animals or humans, but we can look. Antibody titers by age in the study population. We can look at this. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through, look at promising titles, look at promising summaries, and see what I can find. And from that, I'm going to move into the next step of reading something and writing something. But One thing I do is I take the questions I've written and I write them out on separate pages in my research journal. And as I find answers to those questions, I write them down and I note which source they came from, so that later when I'm ready to start actually writing my research essay, I have an idea of what I've learned about my own curiosity and where I have learned it from. So this can be a useful way to get started with your research process, to start identifying useful sources and to kind of get off the ground in determining what you want to learn. At any time, if you're looking for help, we are happy to help you in the FECC Writing Lab, which is BL213.